This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. In 538 BC, the Persians conquered Babylon. Then the Persian king freed all of the Babylonians' captives. One people he encouraged to return home were the Judeans.
Cyrus, king of Persia, says this: Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build him a temple in Jerusalem, in Judah. Whoever among you belongs to the full tally of his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of Yahweh, God of Israel.
But returning to a land their grandparents had left decades before was a daunting challenge. And many Jews who had made successful lives for themselves remained in Babylon. It was the adventurous and the deeply religious who were drawn to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. As soon as the exiles arrived in Jerusalem, work on the Second Temple began. The book of Ezra described the excitement that filled the air.
The people contributed money for the masons and carpenters, and food, drink, and oil for the men from Sidon and Tyre, who brought cedar wood from Lebanon by sea, for which Cyrus, king of Persia, had given permission. The priests in their robes stood forward with trumpets, and the Levites with cymbals, to praise Yahweh. Then all the people raised a mighty shout of praise, since the foundations of the temple had now been laid. Many of the older priests and heads of families who had seen the first temple wept. But many others shouted aloud for joy.
But the temple was the only source of joy for the returnees. The rest of their world was grim. The only Judeans the Babylonians had left behind were the poorest of the peasants. Now, their descendants were on the verge of starvation as they struggled to eke out a living from the land. The only others living nearby were peoples who had been forcibly resettled in Israel after the northern tribes were exiled. These foreigners would do all they could to keep the returnees from gaining a foothold in Jerusalem, for they viewed them as rivals for control of the region. But the worst burden for the returnees to bear was that their ancestral home, Jerusalem, was a wasteland.
The city of Jerusalem is still in ruins. The people who come back to live in the area of Jerusalem go and inhabit those stone buildings that were left standing from the time of the Babylonian destruction. So you have half of the city where people are living in ruined homes, and then another half of the city where nobody is living and the buildings are still standing empty. It would have been something depressing. And after a while, all hope would have gone out of the people, and people would have settled down to a life of discontent.
Soon, even the building of the temple slowed to a crawl, crippled by conflict between the returnees and the foreigners. The ruthless uprooting of groups like the Judeans, who were then resettled with peoples of entirely different ethnicity and religion, had led to turmoil throughout the Middle East. In Judea, law and order had completely broken down. By convincing the Persians that the Jews were planning to rebel, the foreigners won an order suspending the rebuilding of the temple. Eventually, the Jews received permission to continue, but were too poor and too apathetic to finish the work. After they arrived, the return home of the exiles seemed like a horrible mistake. But then, a remarkable man arrived in Jerusalem. His name was Ezra, and he had been sent by the Persian king to restore order to Jerusalem.
Artaxerxes, King of Kings, to the priest Ezra. Greetings. Now here are my orders. You are being sent to Judah and Jerusalem. You are to appoint magistrates and scribes to administer justice for all who know the law of your gods. And you are to teach it to all who do not know it.
Ezra is a scribe and a priest. One didn't become a scribe because he was born a scribe. One became a scribe by dint of talent, intelligence, literacy, and creativity. So now comes back to Jerusalem a man of rank and privilege and political power.
Ezra had come from Babylon, where Jewish scribes had written the first edition of the Hebrew Bible. But the mostly illiterate returnees knew nothing about the book, or its stories, or its laws. Now Ezra had a surprise for them.
Ezra didn't come to Jerusalem empty-handed. He came with a book. And that book was almost certainly the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible in the form that we have it today. And he said to the people, this is what we're about, and this is how you must live.
In what would prove to be one of the most important events in history, Ezra gathered all of the people of Judea together in a square near the temple and read them the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah.
That makes Ezra kind of a new Moses. He's the lawgiver. He's the one who stands up and tells the people, well, you haven't known exactly the right thing to do until now, but from this day forward, you will always know the right thing to do. And it's in this scroll right here.
You are the children of Yahweh, your God. You must take all the tithes of your harvest for the year and gather them together in your community. Then the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow living in your community will come and eat. I am giving you this command. Always be open-handed with your brother. and with anyone in your country who is in need and poor. Remember that you were once a slave in Egypt, and Yahweh your God redeemed you. That is why I am giving you this order.
The central possession of the Jews is the Torah, and it became the central possession of the Jews that day, the day that Ezra had it read in Jerusalem. Before that, they had parts of the Torah, but that day they had the whole thing. And for the 2,500 years since then, that's been the governing force of the Jews, the highest ideal, all of it. The history, the laws, the principles of Torah, all come out of that moment in history.
After the ceremony in which Ezra read the Torah, the people of Judea were asked to sign a contract agreeing to live according to the laws of the Bible. The document they signed was revolutionary. Proof that the Israelites' God cared not just about kings and priests, but about farmers and weavers, mothers and fathers.
This is a profoundly democratic religious revolution. What Ezra declared that day is there is no secret knowledge in Israel. In traditions all over the world, there were always mystery priests and rites that other people couldn't know. But the Torah is full of the exact rites that the priests follow in the temple. And what that means is every Israelite can know what the priests know, what the teachers know. God's revelation is for anyone who chooses to understand it. Not one revelation to the prophet and one to the priest, and then a lower order of revelation to the average person in the street. But rather, everyone can seek God. Everyone can understand God's teaching.
Ezra's call for all Jews to participate in the covenant revitalized Jerusalem. The temple especially was transformed. For the Torah required that the temple play a central role in Jewish life.
You must not put the firstborn of your herd to work, or shear the firstborn of your flock. You must eat it, you and your household, each year, in the presence of Yahweh your God.
During the time of the Second Temple, there was only one place where sacred time and sacred space came together. And it was the whole spectacle and structure and ritual of the sacrifices that was the vehicle by which people came close to God. So if you lived in the north of Israel and it came time to celebrate Passover, you wanted to bring an animal, one of your animals, to the temple, you would sell your animal, take that money, make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, buy another animal, and bring it to the temple. And you can imagine that with all of that preparation, what that moment must have been like for a penitent who came all that distance, went through all that trouble. That moment finally came when he laid his hands on this animal and established it as, this is my gift to God. This is what I'm going to eat along with God, in God's presence. You can imagine the power of that.
In addition to its laws about how human beings should treat God, the Bible had a great deal to say about how human beings should treat each other, making it one of the most sophisticated law books in the ancient world. And yet, for a man to administer laws that were written centuries earlier was not an easy task. One law forbid Jews to marry foreigners, to keep them from worshiping foreign gods. But in the tumultuous years since the return, many Judeans had married foreign women. After great deliberation, Ezra decided he had no choice but to order these men to divorce their wives.
You have committed treason by marrying foreign women. You have added to the sin of Israel. But now, give thanks to Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, and do his will by separating from your foreign wives.
Ezra's conception of the Jewish people was as a holy people, Zerah Kodesh, he called them. And that was important to him precisely because they lived not alone, but among other peoples. So it was very, very important to create a kind of religious state apart from the actual physical state. The religious state would be the Jewish people marrying their own kind and constituting, therefore, the holy seed.
The divorcing of foreign wives, with which some Jews bitterly disagreed, was a sign of the challenges to come. The Bible often spoke in metaphors, and from the time Ezra made it public, people would argue fiercely about its true meaning.
There are all kinds of societies that have disagreements, and certainly that is likely to be the case with a group of people returning from exile. They all have their vision of what society ought to be once we get back there. But precisely because it happened among people whose eyes were focused on the past, who were in this mode of return, meant that their disagreements would quickly become disagreements about the texts that talked about that past, disagreements about Scripture. And this tradition, as it were, of disagreeing about Scripture really became the kind of leitmotif of the entire post-exilic period.
One of the most important disagreements was triggered by a book that dared to challenge the message put forth by the scribes who edited the Bible. The scribes' explanation of Jewish history was based on their belief that God was fair, and he rewarded the good and punished the evil. But a new book, written after the return, argued that God did not work that way at all. The hero of the book, a wealthy and upright man named Job, suffered a series of catastrophes. Job's crops were destroyed by drought, his flocks killed by disease, and all 10 of his children died. Then Job's own body was racked by illness. As he sat by the roadside, mourning the loss of all he held dear in sackcloth and ashes, Job posed one of life's great questions. Why is it that bad people often prosper, while good people often suffer?
Why are the wicked allowed to live, grow old, and win prosperity? Yet they have said to God, "Away from us, we do not want to know your ways." I rescued poor men when they cried, and orphans, people none would help. Desperate, ruined men would bless me, and I brought song to the widow's heart. Yet horror has rolled over me, and driven off my dignity like wind. I wealth has vanished like a cloud, and now my life is spilling out of me. I hoped for good, got only wrong. I hoped for light, got only darkness. I go about in sunless gloom.
Job seems to be reacting to the view that there is basically one powerful, good God in the world who can be counted on to reward the righteous and punish the wicked. This is the central idea of most of the biblical books, and certainly of all of the biblical histories. And Job is reacting against this by saying simply that this is not the case. This is just not reality as we know it. Reality doesn't bear out the thesis that God consistently rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked.
Job did not expect to receive his reward for being a good man after he died. Into the 4th century BC, Judeans viewed the Bible as a book about their past, not their future. And few believed in an afterlife.
Even a tree has hope. If you cut it, it sprouts again. But man, when he wearies and dies, when a human gives out, where is he then? Water vanishes from a lake. Rivers dry up, parched. And man lies down and does not rise.
The philosophy of Job would become a critical challenge to Judaism. If there was no reward for being good, no punishment for being bad, then why bother obeying God's laws? It was a question that would prove even more difficult for Jews to answer when the chance arose to embrace an entirely new and exciting way of life. In the 4th century BC, a remarkable people invaded the Middle East. They were the Greeks. Led by one of the greatest generals in history, Alexander the Great, the Greeks would conquer the world, from Greece to India. But there was far more to the Greeks than military prowess. The Greeks had created the most sophisticated civilization the world had ever seen. Their magnificent art was inspired by a reverence for the human body, which also found its expression in the athletic feats on display in their Olympic Games. But the Greeks also revered the mind. And their greatest thinkers were responsible for the flowering of philosophy, science, and mathematics. As a result, Hellenic architecture, politics, and economics were centuries ahead of the other peoples of the world. For the Jews, the takeover of most of the known world by the Greeks was a threat more dire than any a mere army could pose.
When the Greek world expanded ever eastward, ultimately the Jews of the land of Israel found themselves almost literally smack in the middle of the Hellenistic Empire. We were surrounded by Hellenistic culture, and willy-nilly we found ourselves becoming Hellenists. This triggered both a great advance and a great struggle within the Jewish people for how we would identify. Would we simply succumb to Hellenism, or would we somehow maintain our unique identity as a people?
The Greeks brought brilliant innovations to Judea. that would completely transform daily life. For thousands of years, the people of the Middle East had survived through barter. But the Greeks encouraged the widespread use of money. Suddenly, merchants throughout the region could sell their goods to anyone, anywhere.
Economically, the world was now open. People start leaving their villages, leaving their towns. For the first time in world history, we're going to find large numbers of people moving more than 20 or 30 miles from their village. And Jews were no different from others. This, I think, was the great innovation of the Hellenistic world, a mass movement.
Greek culture offered Jews exciting new opportunities. The many farmers who produced olive oil could now sell their oil in cities from Alexandria to Athens. As this trade flourished, Jewish communities were established in cities throughout the Greek Empire. And new Greek cities were built in Judea. But as the Greek influence in Jewish life grew, more and more Jews worried that their own culture was about to be crushed.
We can understand how the ancient Jews regarded Hellenism simply by reminding ourselves how traditional societies around the world have regarded the coming of American culture, movies, Western styles of dress, Western technology. In our own times, we have seen how violently the more traditional elements of Islam and Judaism and Christianity have regarded the materialistic, secular culture of the Western world.
As this remarkable new culture swept from its cradle in Greece across the Middle East, devout Jews faced a monumental challenge. How could Judaism, with its focus simply on being good, compete with the vibrant and exciting way of life the Greeks had to offer? But then, Judaism underwent a revolutionary transformation. It began with a teacher who lived in the 2nd century BC named Ben Sira. Ben Sira was deeply influenced by the Greek philosophical tradition of Socrates and Plato.
Happy the man who meditates on wisdom and reasons with good sense, who studies her ways in his heart and ponders her secrets.
One can almost categorize Ben Sira as being one of the first Jewish philosophers. That is to say,